When the sun lowers toward the horizon and the sky turns black, when lines blur and things are not exactly what they seem, when the normal makes way for the strange and unexplained, it's time to question what is natural and what lies beyond our understanding. It's time to enter the edge of the unknown with your host, Mark Henry.
Hey everybody, and welcome to the Edge of the Unknown. So happy to be back, bringing you the best in paranormal talk, this time in podcast format. Some of you have reached out to me and asked, hey, why not the live show on Sunday nights anymore? Well, a couple of things. Number one, it's kind of hard to do with a newborn, and quite frankly, it's also hard for my guests to kind of carve out 2 to 3 hours on a Sunday night. So, you know what, I had to step away from it for a little while, but I'm glad to be back, being able to do it whenever we can, and lining up some really cool guests for you. Speaking of which, terribly happy to have an awesome guest coming on to the program right now. Ben Radford, Deputy Editor of Skeptical Inquirer magazine. He's also a research fellow with the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry. If you have not seen this guy on any of the paranormal shows, you're not paying attention. He has been on all of them. A researcher, an explorer, and an author of 12 books. We're going to be talking about some of those tonight. It is a pleasure to kick off the Edge of the Unknown with a friend of the Edge for many, many years. Ladies and gentlemen, Ben Radford. So, Ben Radford, what's going on? You just sent me a message that in a week or so you're heading across the pond. Let's start with that. What have you been up to?
Yeah, busy with different stuff. It's actually kind of cool. I'm sort of here and there and everywhere. Just this past week or so, I was on Expedition Unknown, the Josh Gates show, and I flew out to Puerto Rico to investigate the chupacabra, as you know, one of my favorite cryptid monsters, and that was a cool show. And I'm actually going to be featured in an upcoming documentary film titled Wrinkles the Clown, which is about a scary clown in Florida that was in some cases threatening kids, and in some cases parents were threatening this clown to their kids. So,
jeez.
Good times, right? I write a book titled Bad Clowns, and suddenly I'm the bad clown expert.
Well, that's not a bad thing. That's a good thing. It keeps you busy.
It's not a bad thing. No, it's actually kind of cool. I'm going to be I'll be in the UK for about a week. I'm actually going out there for a band that I'm a big fan of called Shriekback. They had one or two big hits in the 80s. Probably the best known one is called Nemesis. It has lyrics about parthenogenesis and zombies and this and that, dinosaurs. They have a crowdfunding thing, and I contributed some money to them, and they're going to play a gig. So I'm going to, for the first time and probably the last time ever, going to get a chance to meet the band and see them play a gig. And while I'm out there, I'm going to give a talk for the London skeptics in the pub. And yeah, it'll be fun.
Very cool. Now, Shriekback, they provide the theme music for your podcast, right?
They do. Yeah, that's right. Squaring the Strange. It was, I had actually, it's sort of a fun story. Shriekback, again, they were pretty notable in the 80s, but they're different members and band Gang of Four and XTC. But they're still making music, and I've been a fan of theirs for a while. And a year or two back, they offered commission songs, and I was one of about a dozen or so people that gave them some money, and I gave them the title, and they composed and created a song, and I used one of the songs for Squaring the Strange.
That's really cool. I love having those kind of neat connections. That, you know, when I do bumps with this, some of the stuff I use is local musicians, guys that I grew up with. And just another way for me to, you know, obviously it's only, 25 seconds of a song, but it's just neat to have those connections that it opens up a whole bunch of different audiences. I mean, people who like Shriekback that might never have thought to listen to Squaring the Strange or maybe aren't even into skepticism, maybe they give it a shot because they see that.
Yeah, in fact, it's funny you should mention that. There's I think 6 or 7 of us that paid for this tier to go and meet the band and see a gig, and one of the guys he I think he's outside of Detroit. And we didn't know each other, from Adam, and the only thing we knew about each other was we were all going to be at the Shriekback gig, and I met him online, and he's really cool. He's a skeptic, and so yeah, it's funny. It's a small world.
That's awesome. Before I move past the clown thing, I want to come back kind of to that for a second. Do you see a resurgence in reports of that crazy clown phenomenon when movies like It and It Part 2 come out?
Yes. It was really interesting. There was of course, a famous clown panic, and it was literally a panic, and it happened about 6 or 9 months after my book came out. And I had some friends sort of tongue in cheek saying, were you in face paint, Radford? Were you drumming up publicity for your book? But no, it was crazy. I think my book came out in like March or something. And that Halloween season in 2016, all of a sudden you had clown panics. You had literally clown lockdowns. You had schools that were locked down because of threats about clowns, and clowns threatening to shoot up schools, and this spread. And we could talk more about it later, but it spread everywhere. And so all of a sudden there were reports in England, in Sweden, in Europe. And it was this really sort of contagious copycat thing, and part of it is due to, of course, the resurgence in It Part 2 and these other sorts of films, and part of it is there's this it's predictable basically, because it's every Halloween for the past basically 3-4 years there has been at least one or more scary clown stories in the news, because people love these sorts of weird ass stories.
Now, the reason I reached out to you, you've been on The Edge of the Unknown a number of times. We've talked about different things. Sometimes we've talked about your paranormal investigations. We've talked about Chupacabra and your travels with that. And what I thought this time we could focus in on a little bit about, and it's kind of a transition from this thing with clowns, the irrational fears that stem from the paranormal. And it doesn't necessarily have to be urban legends and that sort of thing. I just think that a lot of folks are very afraid of something that, well, it might be scary. And like I said, I've seen some weird things that are startling. But I think that there is a tendency for people who are interested in the paranormal to kind of take things a little farther than they probably need to with some of the irrational fears that they might have with it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and in some cases, there's a self-perpetuating aspect to it. So, for example, in a lot of the ghost hunting shows, for example, part of the allure for the shows, for some people, not really for me, but for those who don't know much about ghost hunting, they're sort of amateur armchair ghost hunting, and they love the all the TV shows and all that. Is part of the appeal is the presumed danger level, right? So you have paranormal lockdown, right? You have these these brave ghost hunters who are going in there. They're gonna can they survive 24 hours in a haunted location? And if you research the topic, it's just like you're just rolling your eyes. It's like they're even assuming that ghosts exist, and as you know, I'm skeptical. I've never said they don't exist, but I'm just said that the evidence so far isn't really compelling. But even if they do exist, there are people that have lived literally decades in allegedly haunted houses, in some cases their own houses, with no problem at all. So the idea that suddenly they're in mortal danger if they spend overnight or 2 nights in some place, it's like, really? But that's the narrative that they're trying to push to make the show dramatic. They have to have some reason to try and draw the viewers. What was that? What was that? We were here, and it's just like. But again, that's one of the things that I find interesting, particularly about the ghost shows, is there's this sort of assumed or imputed danger or personal threat level that really doesn't exist outside of horror films.
In your last book about the science behind ghost hunting, one of the things I know that you mentioned was this desire to be scared. Obviously, that's part of it, but doing things in the lights and taking away your body's own inherent senses for letting pieces of equipment do their talking. And again, I'm not knocking it. I've been on some of these things, and it's been interesting. It's been fun. But is that also part of that fear of, or creating a fear by kind of robbing yourself of sight if you're doing it in the light, with the lights off, or that danger might be coming from, hey, I might trip over something and cannon right into a door. You know what I mean? Is all that stuff kind of add up to this fear of really what it comes down to is the dark?
I think that is part of it, definitely. There's a natural and an understandable fear of the dark that the humans have. Humans are visual animals. We need light to see. Most animals do. Bats don't really need light, that much light, because of course they move and find prey by echolocation, for example. But certainly humans, if we are in the dark, we're literally in the dark. We are at a distinct disadvantage, just in terms of knowing what's going on around us and threats and things like that. And so there's a natural and understandable psychological fear of the dark. It's funny, every now and then I'll talk to somebody who is terrified of going swimming at night. Even inside a pool, I feel like if the lights are off in the pool, there's just there's this idea that you can't see below you. And I said, well, yeah, but like if you're in the ocean, beyond maybe 10 feet deep, you can't see below you anyway. I mean, for all you know, there's a shark, just right below your feet, but you can't see it because there's so many suspensions and stuff in the water. But there's just this psychological uneasiness with, I can't see down there, even though of course they couldn't see down there if it was bright daylight. So I think that a lot of the ghost shows, I mean, that's exactly what they play on. And so part of it's understandable. And when you look at the psychology of ghost experiences, and as you know, I go into that in the book, there's a reason why most ghosts are reported in the evening or at night. And there's a couple reasons, actually. One of them is that during the daytime, you're less likely to think about ghosts, right? You're working, or you're a forklift driver, you're an accountant, you're a doctor, you're a cab driver, you're whatever the hell you're doing during the day. And so your mind is occupied by everyday, ordinary, mundane business. But then you get home, maybe crack open a beer, you're relaxed, maybe you're smoking something, who knows? It gets late at night, and psychologically, your defenses start weakening a bit, right? So you start misperceiving things. And I'm not saying that magically when the sun goes down, people are seeing ghosts where there aren't any, but there's a clear psychological tendency towards misperceptions that's normal. That's what happens when if you stay out all night, for example. If you're late, up all night, or just tired, and you see things that might not be there. You sort of get paranoid, whatever else. And so that's all about the psychological perception of why ghosts are more likely to appear. And also, of course, we take our cues from media, right? From horror films. Horror films usually take place, in a dark and spooky place, right? They're haunted mansions, they're dungeons, they're not well lit, wide open spaces. Those don't make good horror films. And so in our minds, the darkness, the shadows, the hallway at night that's only partially lit by the light from the living room is exactly where you might expect to see a ghost.
And I owe you a huge apology. I think I referred to your book as Joe Nichols' book. You wrote Investigating Ghosts, A Scientific Search for Spirits, as well as Scientific Paranormal Investigation. And I think I referred to it as, I think Joe wrote a book called The Science of Ghosts or something like that. So
you're correct. I noticed it, and I was like, think that's the title of my book, but
No,
I'll let it go.
And you
But,
you shouldn't have let it go. You got to call me out on stuff like that.
No.
So let's expound on this, because you do mention that yes, all of this stuff is kind of based on the idea of those fears, and you mentioned going out into the water. I had a buddy like that, God rest his soul. That was the same way. If he got out above his head at night, forget it. He just it was really kind of alarming, because he would forget, I think, sometimes, or maybe have a couple of beers and try to test how far he could go, and oh my God, he was hell on wheels getting out of the water. But anyway, so with this, and maybe we can talk a little bit about the fears people have. I mean, you wrote this book, Bad Clowns. I've never liked clowns. And I know it's not necessarily paranormal, but I don't have a fear of them. I've just never liked them.
Mm-hmm.
But I can totally understand why people have a fear of spiders or snakes. They're foreign for most folks. They're creepy crawly, and that I can totally dig.
Right.
Still not understanding the science or the psychology behind it, but a ghost has never killed anybody that we know of. No one's ever, outside of people getting into stupid accidents while going on ghost hunts. I don't understand why anybody would be terribly, terribly afraid, outside of things being startling, as I mentioned earlier.
Right.
I'm just not really sure why anybody would be afraid of something that can't possibly hurt you.
Well, that you raise an interesting question. One of the interesting aspects of the scary clowns and bad clowns and evil clowns, which I wrote about, is coulrophobia, as you mentioned, the fear of clowns, and it's a real fear, but it's not. It's only sort of quasi-legitimate. And by that, I mean, there are people that are genuinely afraid of clowns, but the idea of being afraid of clowns is far more pervasive than people that are actually afraid of clowns. Allegedly Johnny Depp and Bill Bob Thornton and P. Diddy and various other people, Kramer on Seinfeld, had fear of clowns. Very famously Bart Simpson. But of course, in Bart Simpson's case, there's the T-shirts and the posters and him saying, "Can't sleep, clowns will eat me." But of course, in that case, it's not irrational, because Sideshow Bob actually was trying to kill him. Krusty necessarily wasn't, but Sideshow Bob was, and so in that case, that's not irrational at all. I mean, it just happens that the person trying to kill Bart was a sideshow guy. So it's one of those things where there is some people are genuinely afraid of clowns, but if you look at genuine phobias, that is the subset of anxiety disorders, you find that clowns don't even make the top 10. Right? There are far, far more people afraid of heights or spiders, right, or enclosed spaces, or take your pick, than there are clowns. And so when I was researching the book, I was making an effort to try and track down psychologists who had actually treated people who are afraid of clowns, and I found virtually none. On occasion, you would find an article that quoted somebody, but nobody that I ever saw referenced said that, this is a serious nationwide thing. And part of it is because, of course, with most things that we're afraid of, we can control our proximity to them, right? So if you're afraid of spiders, well, spiders isn't a good example, because there's some spiders pretty much everywhere, depending on how hard you look. Right. But for example, if you're afraid of heights, then don't go in high places. If you're afraid of small spaces like elevators, then don't go there. If you're afraid of sharks, then stay the hell out of the water. Right. So in the case of clowns, clowns are eminently avoidable. Right? So the clowns are in certain specifically proscribed social spaces. So for example, if you go to a circus, that's where clowns are. If you're going to ask, if this was, Family Feud, and someone asked you, name me the top 5 places you're going to find clowns, circus is right at the top, or backyard parties, for example. And so, if you're genuinely freaked out by clowns, then you just avoid them. But so what you find is that the clowns that scare people in pop culture, in books like It, for example, and miniseries and movies and things like that. Part of the reason they're frightening to people is that they're out of place. They're not where they're supposed to be. So many people like clowns. Again, in certain, there's like, okay, I like clowns, stay here. Don't, if you're in the circus, that's fine. If you're walking around a Target by yourself, that's really not so fine. If you're knocking on my door at midnight, that's really not fine. So that's why, for example, during the clown panic that we mentioned earlier in 2016 and later years, the clowns that people were reporting were scary clowns. And they weren't scary because they were necessarily threatening people. They were scary because they were walking around a park by themselves late at night. And, if it was anybody else, if it's just some ordinary person, maybe it's a bum or someone walking their dog, whatever else. But if there's a clown, then something's up. Something's fishy with this clown, because there's a reason why someone went to the effort to get dressed up and is presenting themselves as a clown. And then the question is, well, if the clown is by himself or herself, then what's going on here, right? Because clowns, they're performers. They perform in front of backyard parties. They perform in front of birthday parties for audiences, through circus, whatever else. But if you have a single clown out of the ordinary places where we expect to see clowns, that creeps people the hell out.
Let's introduce the crypto world to this. And the reason I'm thinking of this is, yes, there's a lot of TV shows about, a Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever you want to call it. I rarely find anyone who's into things like Bigfoot or lake monsters that have stories where they are afraid, when, quite frankly, if there is an 800-pound wood ape running around in the woods, that's a hell of a lot more dangerous than anything else that we've talked about so far tonight.
You're exactly right. No, you hit the nail on the head with that, right? And so that brings up the question: what is the basis for this fear? And for a lot of people, let's just take, for example, you mentioned Bigfoot believers. For a lot of Bigfoot believers, it's really interesting when you talk to them, and I'm sure you've encountered this yourself. For many of them, Bigfoot isn't scary. It's the same thing, for example, with Nessie and Ogopogo and other creatures, where there's a certain, they don't really fit the quote unquote monster category. They do, in that they are unnatural. They are not part of the known taxonomy of animals and whatever else. So they're monstrous in terms of being bigger and more powerful and unusual, or if not unique. But they're not monsters insofar as they're evil. So, for example, a lot of Bigfoot believers see Bigfoot not as some terrifying creature that's liable to rip their guts out and chew on their intestines, although that might happen, but instead as sort of a peaceful wisdom keeper. Right? You read account, you talk to people who have seen Bigfoot, and a lot of times when I've talked to them, it's not this terrifying experience. It's not like, oh my God, I saw this thing and it came towards me and then, I crapped my pants and I thought I was going to die. It was, I was out hiking by myself and I saw this creature and it escaped, and it was just this beautiful moment. And they describe it in this sort of loving, life-changing epiphany type experiences. And some people I've talked to have described encounters with Bigfoot as sort of a gift. It's something that makes them special. They say, lots of people talk about seeing Bigfoot, on TV and this and that, but I saw one. Like, I was chosen to experience this. And you see the same theme, for example, with some people who report UFO sightings and reports. And some people, of course, claim that they've been abducted by aliens and experimented with anal probes and whatever else. But there's this notion that they were special. They were selected to receive this experience. And talk about it, and in some cases, advocate for protecting Bigfoot as a endangered species type thing.
And from what I've found with guys that I've talked to, both locally, some guys from different states, a number of the BFRO guys have been on, they just like going out in the woods. I think that's a huge portion of it too. It's
Yeah.
who doesn't like camping, right?
Right, and you hit on another important point. When people look at, and Sharon Hill wrote a book called Scientific Americans a couple years back, which is a good look at some of the unusual, the I was going to say unusual people. In some cases, they're unusual. A look at some of the groups that go out, investigating UFOs and Bigfoot and things like that. And one thing that's often lost in the sort of public's discourse and talking about ghost hunting groups and Bigfoot groups and that sort of thing is exactly what you just said, is that in many cases it's not about the truth. It's not about seeking an actual Bigfoot body. It's not about thinking you're actually going to go out on a moonless night and see an extraterrestrial come down and give greetings from across the galaxy. It's a hobby. It's friends. It's hanging out with buddies. It's a community experience. And I think that I'm really glad you brought that point up, because I think that point is often sort of lost in the discussions about it, because they oftentimes I hear people talking about these groups and like as if all these members, and they're spending all their time and they're like doing all this really high quality investigation research trying to prove or disprove this. Like, a few of them are, like 80% of them, they just want to hang out with their buddies. They want to get together and go to the local haunted house outside of town on a legend trip, and and go find a broken mirror and see if you can find Bloody Mary. And it's fun, it's community, it's friends, it's hanging out. It's some people get together on on Saturday nights and play poker. Some people get together and make model airplanes. Some people go out there and look for ghosts and Bigfoot.
When did you start to notice? And I know the ghost hunting thing really took off in the early 2000s. But you just mentioned other activities that people used to do. The Bloody Mary thing, light as a feather, stiff as a board. I'm sure every kid tried doing that. When did you see that stuff start coming into this discussion of the paranormal, at least to the mainstream, where all of a sudden it was more of a thing?
Not really sure how to answer that. You mean in terms of like the fear aspects, or?
Yeah, because I know Amityville Horror, the investigation you did here in Western New York, stuff that I grew up, the books and things like that I was reading. When was this sudden change in when people were really interested in it to suddenly being terrified by it?
I think that there's a couple sort of turning points there. I mean, just to sort of broaden the perspective for a moment, and I talk about this in my book, Investigating Ghosts, is, if you look at the history of people trying to find evidence for ghosts, it's actually fairly recent. People have believed in ghosts for millennia. I mean, there's nothing new under the sun. There's ghosts mentioned in Shakespeare. There's ghosts mentioned in the Bible, the Holy Ghost. I mean, there's nothing new about the idea of ghosts, and the idea that maybe the departed spirits are around us or communicating with us in some way or else. So that's not new. What is new, and certainly relatively new in human history, is the notion that you can investigate these ghosts. You can tangibly or empirically prove these. And you saw this, for example, with the emergence of spiritualism in the 1800s with the Fox sisters, who tapped out these messages from this alleged murdered peddler up there in Western New York, and basically launched this what at the time was a really very popular religion. It's not so much anymore. There's still a couple remnants, for example, in Lilydale and Camp Chesterfield in Florida. But if you look at the belief in spiritualism around the turn of the last century, like maybe 1880s to 1920s, it was wildly popular. And so part of that was because you had mediums that were claiming to sort of be a conduit to the next world. So it wasn't just, yeah, there's spirits around us, blah blah blah. It was, there's specific spirits, and I can communicate with you, right? If you're a psychic medium telling people. And so that's when you see, for example, the rise of Ouija boards, and people using this, essentially a parlor game, to spell out messages from the dead. And then you had people like Harry Price and Houdini and others who were trying to, look into the possibility of the afterlife, and in some cases debunk them. So my point here is that if you look at the evolution of the idea that you could communicate with spirits, it's fairly recent. So, if for example, 200 years ago, you talked to somebody and you said, are you communicating with a spirit? They might say, yes. My grandfather, he passed a couple years back, and I sense his presence, whatever else. But this idea that you currently see on TV, for example, of the ghost hunter and the ghost hunter shows, the idea that a group of people with beeping devices and EMF detectors and infrared cameras or else would go to a specific location and seek out a communication with an essentially stranger ghost, right? This isn't some relative of one of the ghost hunters. This is like, well, we went to this location, and is there anyone here? Knock twice if there's a spirit who's present. That would be totally foreign and unknown to people even a few hundred years ago. Like the idea that you would even try or want to communicate with the dead that didn't have some personal connection would just be bizarre. And so I think that, and this sort of ties back into your question, because presumably if you're communicating with the dead and spirits of your relatives, then they're friendly, right? Unless your great grandmother hated you, tried to kill you as a toddler. I didn't ever tell you this, honey, but I tried to strangle you in your crib, right? Unless you're doing that, then most of the ghosts you're going to conceive of and people are going to talk about are benign ghosts. They're friendly ghosts. They're loving ghosts. They're going to support you, and they're there for you through the hard times, things like that. So those are the sorts of messages you're going to get. And then then with the emergence of the more modern versions of the ghost hunters, where people are communicating with unknown spirits, right? So this is where you sort of get into exorcisms and possession and spiritual possession, and the Exorcist in Amityville and these sorts of things. At that point, then the idea of communicating with ghosts is fraught with danger, because you don't know what ghost you're going to get. Right? The ghost directory is out of date. So if you're playing with a Ouija board, which to this day freaks a lot of people out, then that's the occult, right? You're dealing with Satan's toys, because the idea is that you might accidentally open a portal or whatever to unknown spirits or entities. And so that, I think, to sort of circle back to your question, is part of the answer, is that with the emergence of sort of ghost hunting as a vocation, as something that somebody does to go into a location, a professional ghost hunter goes into a location, brings out the beepy devices, and communicates with something potentially evil. That's the basis for hundreds of horror films and novels. But that's not traditionally the way that people thought about ghosts.
So honestly, it's kind of, I mean, even over 100 years or so, a couple hundred years, but obviously the last couple of decades, it's kind of a paranormal evolution where it's going to continue to grow. And if it's not going to be Ouija boards or table rapping or whatever, that was much more popular at the turn of the last century, it'll be something else.
Yeah, absolutely. And they're going to, they're going to keep coming up with these devices and the ways to go about it. I mean, and even that has changed over time. If you look at the folklore of ghosts, which is something I'm particularly interested in, you look at the beliefs about ghosts from a couple of years ago. There's a very book by Owen Davies called The Haunted, which talks about this. And for example, it was believed a couple of years ago that candles glowed blue flame in the presence of ghosts. That's no longer a common belief. And of course, you have to wonder, how did they know that? Right? I mean, how would you, if you were some version of a ghost hunter from 150 years ago, how would you know? Like, oh, my candle is suddenly turning blue, right? But there must be a ghost, or not, right? I mean, there's even to this day, of course, there's no way to really know. But my point here is that as sort of silly and antiquated and quaint as some of the beliefs about ghosts were 150 years ago, I would guess that 150 years from now, some of the most popular and most common assumptions about ghosts will be seen as just as ridiculous and silly as they were back then.
Ben Radford, my guest here on the Edge of the Unknown. We got to take a quick break, but we will be right back, so don't nobody go nowhere.
Looking for the best Japanese and Thai cuisine in Western New York? Then you have to visit Teton Kitchen at 415 Dick Road in Depew. From appetizers and soups, simple, special, big and fusion-style maki, to sushi, sashimi, and tempura, you won't get a range of items like this anywhere. Hungry for more? Teton Kitchen offers a full dinner menu and kushiyaki dishes, as well as a huge variety of sake, wine, beer, both domestic and Asian imports. Owner Taka and his bride Kin are proud to boast that Teton Kitchen is Yelp's #1 rated restaurant in Western New York, and they welcome you for lunch or dinner 7 days a week with takeout and online ordering available. Visit tetonkitchen.com for their full menu, hours, and online ordering, or call 716-393-3720. Teton Kitchen, 415 Dick Road in Depew.
Itadakimasu.
The Hope Project of Western New York is a resource for struggling families often identified as the working poor. We assist individuals who have lost their jobs through no fault of their own, disabled individuals, households with special needs members, victims of domestic violence in transition, and our military families and veterans. The Hope Project provides our members with gently used clothing, household supplies and toys, as well as hygiene and cleaning supplies. We also make available specialty items like prom dresses and Halloween costumes. These items are provided at zero cost to our members. How can you help? By donating items at our storefront, 4545 Transit Road in Williamsville, New York, inside the Eastern Hills Mall. Store hours, Monday 10 to 2, Tuesday 11 to 2, Wednesday 10 to 8, Thursday 10 to 2, and Saturday 10 to 2. Closed on all school holidays. Clothing should be contemporary, free of stains and tears, and household items must be in good condition and in working order. We also accept grocery and department store gift cards, as well as monetary donations. You can also help out by becoming a volunteer. For more information, visit our website at thehopeprojectofwny.org or call us at 716-810-9156. The Hope Project of Western New York. Dignified help for those in need.
Are you ready for something really scary? Stop over to the campfire at Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories on YouTube. Here's some of the most terrifying stories you've ever heard. Ghosts, monsters in the woods, stalkers, unexplained phenomenon, and more. And the best part? All of the stories are true. Got a story you'd like to share? Send it to Uncle Josh, truescarystories@gmail.com. Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories on YouTube, where fact is more terrifying than fiction.
For those interested in delving deep into the paranormal, why not look into the Paratech Store? Located at paratechstore.com, browsers will find the latest in investigative equipment, books, and more. Items go beyond technical equipment. Mojo bags, stone sets, and other curiosities await your exploration. At at the Paratech Store, paratechstore.com. Visit them today.
This is Nick Redfern, and you're listening to Edge of the Unknown with Mark Henry.
And we're back with Ben Radford, author, dare do I say explorer, and deputy editor of Skeptical Inquirer magazine. We are talking about the fears that come with the paranormal. And Ben, I appreciate you doing this, man. I really do.
I'm always glad to be on, man. I love talking to you. It's a great show.
So I was thinking and scribbling down my notes while we were just talking before we took the break. How much does religion play into these fears of the paranormal? You always hear the stories about something weird was going on in the house. We went to the church or whatever, and no one would help us.
Right. Yeah, another great question. I would say that religion plays a big role in some cases. Partly because that's where people get their first introduction to the idea not only of sort of evil incarnate, but a system of evil, if you will. So, you know, if you're everyone's born an atheist. Some people stay an atheist. But let's say that, you know, if you're a child and you've never been indoctrinated into any particular religion, you can see evil acts in the world, right? You see someone doing something bad. Somebody's murdered. Somebody is, you know, drunk driving, kill somebody. There's bad things going on around you, but you don't view it, interpret it within the framework of a bigger, almost conspiracy-like belief system and theology, right? So the differences between there are evil people, or more likely there are people that sometimes do bad things, instead of there's evil in the world and evil is personified, and there is a literal Satan, and the literal Satan, you know, does things, and you know, he has demons at his command, and you get into, you know, Catholic theology and things like that. And so in a lot of cases, and you saw this especially with William Peter Blatty's novel The Exorcist, and of course the follow-ups Legion and whatever else, is I mean, that's exactly why it was framed in terms of exorcism, right? You could have, you know, if you took out the religious aspect of The Exorcist, you don't have much of a story. I mean, there are other religions that believe in demonic possession and believe in spiritual possession. So, for example, you look at Candomblé, an Afro-Brazilian religion. You look at voodoo. There are other religions where people willingly and happily invite spirits to inhabit their body, and it's not seen as evil or destructive or bad. It's cleansing. It's something that you want to do. You go to your bokor, your priest, and you say, you know, I want to have this experience. I want to have one of, you know, many different gods enter my body, and, you know, I may shake, I may dance, I may sing, whatever else. And then it leaves, and, you know, I've learned from that experience. And so if you just take possession outside of the Roman Catholic structure, it's not inherently evil. It's not inherently bad. It's just another path to enlightenment for many people. But within the context of Christian theology and the notion of, you know, the original sin and Satan and you know, and the apple, you know, and all these sorts of things, that is where that provides the groundwork or the structure or the prism through which people believe that evil manifests itself. So, for example, in my investigations into haunted houses over the past, 15, 20 years, I've often encountered people who are ghost hunters who approach it from a distinctly religious viewpoint. And it's always interesting to me because I don't approach it from that viewpoint. I mean, that's certainly a way to look at it. I don't think it's particularly fruitful, but it's interesting to see their belief systems around what they think ghosts are, and of course, you know, demons and ghosts are sort of fluidly combined, right? Because, you know, if something is in your house, is it a ghost? Is it a pixie? Is it a, you know, who knows what it is, right? It is unknown, and anything that's unknown, you can interpret the unknown as being good, you know, a benign ghost, or you can interpret the unknown as being evil. poltergeist or something else. And so with a lot of these ghost hunters, they'll say prayers. They'll carry holy water. They'll do rosaries. I remember on a couple of occasions, I've had other ghost hunting groups bless me. I didn't ask for it. I was like, thank you. I mean, I wasn't, I wasn't making fun of them. They were sincere. I mean, they genuinely believed that there was evil in this house or this location, and they presumably sincerely were concerned for my personal and spiritual safety. And I appreciated it. I didn't believe any of it, and I don't think it did any good, but I wasn't there to debate this with them. If they wanted to throw some holy water on me and protect me, then I was happy to receive it. But it was just interesting seeing the different viewpoints. So to me, for example, a ghost would be investigated on its own terms, right? So it's somebody says something happened. My question is, did it really happen? And if it did happen, are there alternative explanations for it? So that's, I'm trying to investigate it and explain and figure out what's going on. But to a lot of these people, it was really interesting and in some ways kind of scary, because they believed that there was basically literally evil behind every corner and behind every tree. And they saw the world as being far more scary and threatening and hostile and dangerous than I did. And it's because, again, in many of these people's worldviews, Satan is a literal actual creature. It's not a metaphor. There's a real, very real Satan and devil, and that entity is at work constantly trying to corrupt men's souls and women's souls. And so to them, that's eternal vigilance. It's, you have to be careful no matter what you do. If you go into a room, you have to cleanse yourself, and you have to do all these sorts of rituals. And it was odd to me, as somebody who doesn't necessarily share that belief system, to see how frightened they often were and how threatened they felt, because they really felt that they were being attacked by evil all around them.
I've got to bring this up while we're talking a little bit about religion. You and I lived through this in the 80s. What about the irrational fear of Satanists being everywhere? I mean, it was in your video games. It was in the music we listened to. It was a couple of guys screwing around in the park one night, and somebody decided they're doing rituals over there, and all the graffiti right. And everything. I mean, that is really what we're talking about. Completely irrational. And I obviously was in Western New York, but I'm sure that was happening across the country, if not across the world.
Yeah, and it's, you and I are old enough to remember these things. A lot of millennials aren't, and I'm not like back in my day. No, but I'm serious. I mean, it was a real issue for people who aren't aware of that. Maybe the younger generation. This is not two crotchety old guys talking about the scary olden days. This happened only a few decades ago. In some cases, that sort of fear and the satanic panic is still going on, and it was not a joke. There were people who were falsely accused of doing horrific things, of ritual sexual abuse, satanic ritual abuse. There was the McMartin preschool case. There's the Fells Acres case. There were lots of stories, and again, it involved conspiracies, satanic conspiracies. And all these different things. And so we can sort of laugh about it and roll our eyes about it to some degree now, but it was a real issue. It was on the nightly news. Geraldo was flogging this for ratings left and right. And part of the reason all that came up, you can see a microcosm of it every Halloween, because that same fear occurs virtually every Halloween when you have people who are it's not as common as it used to be, but it's still very very much present, where people will, particularly religious fundamentalists, will be concerned about the evils that the evil holiday, right? The Satan's holiday, right? So they have these notions of that, that this time of the year, Halloween, people are dressing up. They're dressing up as ghosts and witches and the occult things. And even to this day, like I said, I mean, just 3 weeks ago, there was a news article about some fundamentalists who were burning Harry Potter books. Right. So this is
right.
We're not talking about something that happened in 1983. We're talking about things that in some stream or other are still going on very much to this day. And let me just take a second to sort of dig into that a little deeper. So if you talk to these people, if you say, look, it's Halloween. These are 8-year-old kids. They're 10-year-olds. They're dressing up as Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle. They're dressing up as, as a character from Halo, whatever else. And you'll say, look, I don't know what you're talking about. This is not some satanic plan. It's the same, that their fears are the same that I talked about a little bit earlier with the Ouija board, is they believe that it's a gateway. And so the concern among many fundamentalists is not so much that little Susie is dressing up as a princess or a witch for Halloween. That part of it isn't that concerning to them. The concern to them is that will open up the door and get them interested in the darker side. If you're a 10-year-old girl and you're dressed up as a witch, well, you're going to start reading books about witchcraft. And, witchcraft, of course, is real. It's real and this and that. And, they sacrifice babies. And so there's this whole religious theological structure behind it. So again, it's not so much that someone's dressing up as an ogre or a mummy or a zombie or vampire. It's that the concern is that children are vulnerable to Satan, that the innocent will be corrupted, and the Harry Potter books, or a Halloween costume by themselves may be innocuous, but if you really understand what's going on, he said, wink, wink, then you understand that this is a very real threat, and that's where they go with it.
And I remember one of the big things, especially when I was in high school, a buddy of mine who was a rabble rouser. Excuse me.
You ran.
What's that?
You ran with rabble rousers?
Yeah, well, not me. And but he brought in.
You were the choir boy.
Yeah, that was me. Yes, I could do no wrong. Yeah, right. He had brought in the Satanic Bible by Anton LaVey, and I remember everybody went bananas. One time, I brought in I don't even remember where I got it, the Necronomicon, and people went crazy. Now, if anybody's actually read the Necronomicon, there's not a whole lot in there that anybody should be too wigged out about. It's the story behind it. It's the theory behind it. And I think that's really what sets people off. They see Anton LaVey. He looks like Ming the Merciless, and he's scary. So there comes that fear again. Yeah.
And part of it is that if you read a lot of this stuff, if you read Aleister Crowley's books or Madame Blavatsky's stuff, it's turgid, dense, boring, silly stuff.
Right.
I mean, it's with all due respect, it's impenetrable. It's confusing. It's nonsensical. It's self-referential to. It's a whole lot of nothing. There's just nothing there. But the idea of Aleister Crowley, the idea of magic and theory and practice and Satanism, it's all so sexy and dramatic. But when you actually lift open the cover, you're like, what? This? Okay.
I'm trying. I got a frog in my throat there. I had on Winter Lake a couple of years back. This is probably going back three or 4 years maybe. And outside of him claiming that he's a Satanist and his experiences with the things that he was messing around with on that side of things, he's a pretty normal guy. I mean, outside of he wants to do what he wants to do and he doesn't care. It's that whole Aleister Crowley, do it thou will, so meet it be, or whatever the heck he said. And I don't know any other Satanists, but just speaking with him for a couple hours one night, he said some stuff that I know a lot of my listeners got angry about, but not really that far out there just a guy who's probably making a couple of bucks by saying, hey, I'm a Satanist.
Yeah, I mean that's, as you mentioned, you look at the Anton LaVey stuff and the Process Church or whatever it was called. They're in a lot of it's show, it's trolling, it's merry pranksters. And I'm not saying that they're necessarily insincere. But it's just the common idea of a Satanist is so far from what a lot of fundamentalists are afraid of. I remember getting into a discussion one time. I was talking to somebody, and she was clearly coming from a sort of a religious background, which is fine, but she was talking about how evil witches are, and I said, I happen to know several witches, and they're not particularly evil. They're they go and they do the rituals, and they're in the forest and they hug trees, and it's all very mundane. If anything, it's boring. There's I think so in her mind, probably because of what the church and what Pat Robertson and all these other people say, that it's like, oh well, the witches are out there sacrificing babies and trying to corrupt the like. No, you don't know anything about what you're talking about.
Most of the stuff we've been talking about tonight with this whole idea of these fears, some irrational, some obviously legit, we've kind of, and maybe this is my fault for doing it, not introducing this earlier, we've been focusing what I would say is probably more of the northern part of North America with all this stuff. From your travels, how do the other cultures you've had a chance to live amongst on the projects that you've worked on approach this sort of thing?
Well, in a lot of cases, it's important to recognize, as I touched on earlier, is that other cultures don't necessarily share our assumptions. They don't, for example, many people in South America or the Caribbean, of certain religions, of course, don't necessarily, as I mentioned, see possession as evil. It can be a good thing, and even frankly, in some fundamentalists, for example, the idea of talking in tongues, for example, which is a sort of a very well-known thing, event, with the evangelicals, particularly in the South. That's talking in tongues. That's literally when the spirit is within you and you're saying things you don't know, and then it goes out of you. So there are certain little strains in there that consider some versions very temporary of possession to be acceptable. But in a lot of cases, in other cultures, for example, I've traveled pretty extensively in South America, and they're not as concerned about a lot of things that maybe American skeptic would be. So there are stories, of course, of ghosts and, monsters and this sort of thing all around the world. But for example, in my travels, many of them are far more concerned about alternative medicine and cults and things like that. So, I'm sure there are ghost hunting groups in Buenos Aires, in Santiago, Chile, and Quito, Ecuador, but that's not really sort of this sort of default standard. This is what paranormal investigation is, because they have their own cultural beliefs, they have their own priorities. I'll give you one quick example. When I was in Peru, I was investigating what's called the Liquichiri, and I talk about this briefly in my Chupacabra book. But the Liquichiri it's a type of vampire, and it sucks the fat out of people. So for a lot of people, a lot of Americans, they'd be like, it sucks the fat out of people. That sounds good to me. I got about 20 extra pounds here. Liquichiri can come suck some of this out. But in another cultural context, for example, in the Andes in South America, fat insulates people. Fat keeps people alive. So to largely overweight Americans, and I'm not casting aspersions, just statistically, most Americans are overweight. The idea of a fat-sucking vampire is weird, if not ridiculous. But in that context, in the context of where, again, in the cold Andes, it's high in the mountains of Ecuador and Peru and Bolivia, losing fat is very real. It's a very real problem. You will freeze to death. So that's one example of some sort of a regional twist that you might see on a scarier paranormal story.
How do they approach the crypto stuff? I mean, you mentioned that you were in Puerto Rico. You've been in South America exploring that legend, which turns out it was probably just mangy feral dogs. But up here, there were all the T-shirts and the bloodsucker that it's coming. And did they approach it the same way there, or was that just more hype that somebody up here put on it?
Well, in the case of the chupacabra, that was another interesting aspect of it, was that for the most part, in Puerto Rico, for example, many of the people in urban areas weren't that concerned about it. The chupacabra was originally mostly a concern in the rural areas because, of course, the chupacabra, the goat sucker, attacked livestock. And if you're a lawyer in downtown San Juan, you don't have any livestock, so you don't really care. It's probably a joke, but even if there is some goat or chicken sucking mystery creature out there in rural in the center part of Puerto Rico, you don't care because that's not part of your life. And so even back in the early parts of the chupacabra story, it was regionalized. And so again, in the urban areas, it didn't get much play. It wasn't a real concern. And this actually ties back into what I mentioned a second ago about the likichiri. So in the rural areas where the possible existence of some mysterious, unknown, blood-sucking creature attacking a goat or a chicken or hogs or something else, it's a real problem. It may not be a real problem to you or me, but a lot of these people are subsistence farmers, right? They may only have 3 head of cattle, 5 chickens, and a goat, and the loss of a couple chickens and a goat could be important to their livelihood. And so there's a different standard of living out there, and so that's one reason why it's especially important. And so again, so even within that culture, you have these different dynamics of people who are concerned. But you also, for example, in a lot of cases, the paranormal is taken as a matter of fact. So, for example, when I was researching a creature called the duende in Central America, primarily in Belize and Honduras, and Costa Rica, and it's this sort of it's almost like an elf or a fairy-like creature. It's a little man, 3 to 4 feet tall, has a red hat and a beard, and he has his feet on backwards. And he's in Belizean folklore and other folklore of the region. He's sort of this man of the woods, and he's not a Bigfoot type man of the woods. He's not big and muscular and hairy. He's small and hairy and diminutive, and he's a trickster figure. And the reason that his feet are on backwards, in case you're wondering, is as I mentioned, he's a trickster figure. And so if you're walking in the jungle or in a field and you see small footprints going in one direction, he's actually going in the other direction because his feet are backwards. And in many places in Belize and elsewhere, he's believed. It's not to them it's not a local legend. To folklorists, it's a legend and a story of routes. To many people, it's a matter of fact. Yeah, there's a duende in the woods, and he does this, he does that. Not a big deal. I'll tell you one quick story. When I was in Costa Rica, I spent a week or so looking for the chupacabra in this area near the coast, and I was out there with a guy named Fernando, and I was in the border area between Nicaragua and Costa Rica, and we were there I was basically in the jungle. It was we had to take a bus and then a boat, and it was just basically in the middle of nowhere. And we spent about a week out there in the jungle looking for evidence of chupacabra and looking for tracks and this and that. And didn't find any. Spoiler alert, but it's mentioned in chapter, I think, 3 of my chupacabra book. And I came back, And on the way back home, we stopped back in the town where we originally came in. And, we were tired, just spent a week in the jungle, we're happy to have air conditioning and a bed to sleep in. And as long as I was there, we had to leave the next morning for a bus back up to Managua. And I asked somebody there, I said, as long as I'm here, have you heard about the duende? And he's like, oh yeah. So I'm listening to duende stories. And one of the women says, in fact, many years ago, there was a baby that was abducted by a duende. And he was just taken from his house, and he reappeared several days later in the woods. And I'm like, what? I mean, so this is like a first-hand story. It's like, yeah, this happened. It was like 20 some years ago. And I'm like, wow, this is interesting. I've never interviewed somebody who was abducted by a duende. I said, can I talk to this person? And he says, well, he doesn't live here anymore. He's actually a tour guide up down the river. We had just spent a week with this guy. And I only later found out after we left that he was allegedly abducted by a duende. And I mean, he was still in the wood. There was no way to go back. I was like, oh, this would have been such an interesting interview. So
funny how that works sometimes. It's amazing.
Yeah. So, do we have time? Do you need to take a break? Or want me to talk?
No, but we should. I'm going to take. Actually, what I'll do is I'm going to do. Now we can do like another 10 minutes or so if you got time.
Yeah. All right. Well, let me give you one other quick little thing. It's interesting.
Sure, go for it.
So another example would be the belief in witchcraft in sub-Saharan Africa. And again, it's something where, for a lot of Americans and Westerners, the idea of witchcraft, other than, of course, in very small pockets of fundamentalists who are, concerned that Harry Potter is going to introduce, 12-year-old girls to witchcraft. Other than that, it's sort of seen as this sort of silly, weird, all that happened, centuries ago in Europe and the witch trials and Salem, this and that. But in many parts of the world, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, belief in magic and witchcraft is very much real. It's going on right now. A friend of mine named Leo Igwe is a Nigerian fellow, and he's done lots of research and advocacy over the years of trying to stamp out these religious beliefs and witchcraft accusations. So again, witchcraft accusations. Again, it's easy for us to sort of, oh, well, that was the Salem witch trials. That was 1750s Germany. No, witchcraft accusations are 2015 Pakistan. They're 2017 India. They're 2019 Kenya and Africa. These are going on to this day. And we don't really talk about them so much because it's not really on Westerners or American radar, but it still happens. And if you look at the role that witchcraft and belief of black magic has in Africa, in many cases, for example, if a person is really successful in their business, other rivals will assume or believe that he used black magic to get ahead. So so black magic and witchcraft is seen as a way to screw over your rivals or to win over lovers and all that sort of thing. And one particularly toxic version of it, and I've written about this before, there's the Muti murders. There are people who will actually kill and cut off the body parts of albinos. And this has happened for many years, primarily in East Africa, Tanzania and Kenya and around there, where and if you've seen the film District 9, there's actually a scene of Muti in there where this guy is brought in, and I think it's his finger, some body part is about to be cut off by this warlord, and that's actually based on things that actually happened, and they happen to this day. And there's been horrific attacks and machete attacks and killings by people in Africa who believe that albinos are magical, and of course the albinos stand out, particularly in a continent of dark-skinned people. So not only do they not have the protection from the sun that's normally conferred by pigmentation, but they also have the added concern about being hacked to death by somebody who believes that their finger or their penis or their ear can be used in a magic spell.
Wow, that's kind of terrifying. That's not an irrational fear.
No, it's not an irrational fear, and that's why in my work and my research I try to impress upon people that belief in myths have consequences. There are silly beliefs, there are serious beliefs, but in the wrong framework or in the right framework, seemingly bizarre or ridiculous or completely foundless beliefs can have dire consequences. In some cases, people being killed.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in a pretty short amount of time tonight. And one of the last things I wanted to ask you was, if you're doing a talk or you have the ability to talk to some folks who maybe have some of the fears that we've talked about tonight, how do you approach that? What do you tell them? And are they receptive to the way that you approach it?
Another good question. In my line of work, I often end up dealing with people who have unfounded fears. I'm not saying they're all unfounded, but I'm just saying that in many cases, I'm dealing with people who sincerely believe that their house is haunted. And, there's the case in Western New York that you referred to earlier that I did, and I published in one of my books, where it was this family of three who they believe their house was haunted. And they called me up and I went and investigated the case and solved it. And they ended up, being able to sleep again in their own house. But people report, fear of ghosts, of Satanists, of this and that and the other. And one of the most common ones actually is curses. I would say about once a month, I get an email from somebody who is concerned that they have been cursed, and they seek my help. And those are difficult cases because, I don't think they're trolling me. I mean, in many cases, it's pretty clear that they're sincere and they're freaked out. Maybe a psychic told them that some recent bad luck was the result of a curse or whatever else, and they're freaking out. Or they believe in the evil eye, for example. And so I try to do a couple different things. I try to, number one, soothe their fears and try to explain to them that it's okay. Calm down. Don't get so worked up about it because fear is harmful. Fear is not going to help you out. So, but at the same time, I have to, and this comes from my background in psychology, I have to meet them where they are. So I can't just sort of have this dismissal. Well, as a skeptic, I can tell you that all curses are bullshit. No, that doesn't do any good. Because the second that they sense that you're dismissive or ridiculing or mocking, even if you're not, they shut you out and they won't listen to you. So I have to understand where they're coming from and meet them halfway. And so in some cases, and this actually happened to be the case that I mentioned earlier in the Buffalo case, where I said, look, I in my experience, I don't think you're cursed, or I don't think that your house has an evil entity in it. But I could be wrong. But even if you are cursed, even if there is something weird going on in your house, we can fix it. So you have to give them the opportunity. You have to leave that door open a crack so that you can. And I don't want to encourage their beliefs at all. But if I totally say that there's no truth to it, and again, I don't know, I haven't investigated it. But so you have to have that meeting of the minds. And so I tried to do a couple things. I tried to, number one, calm their fears. Number two, tell them that there are ways to solve this. And in many cases there are, in terms of psychologically, whatever else. And number three, I try to give them the tools to make their situation better. So even though I can't personally go investigate every single person who think there's something evil in their basement, I can't personally, fly out to go comfort anybody who thinks that they're cursed by some rival or psychic, whatever else. I can give them the tools to say, okay, well, I don't think that this is real, but there are alternative explanations. Is it possible that what you're interpreting as a curse maybe isn't a curse? Maybe it's ordinary bad events. Is it possible that this evil spirit that you're interpreting could be something else? And so I try to give them other alternatives and hope that they go through those doors.
Deputy Editor of Skeptical Inquirer magazine, Ben Radford, BenjaminRadford.com. We didn't mention that enough, so I'll make sure that we do that when we get this baby published. I appreciate you coming on, man. I had a blast. I hope you did too.
I did. I appreciate your listening to me ramble on. I always love talking to you. It's I do a lot of interviews with people who frankly don't know much about the topic. And it's nice to sort of have an informed discussion with somebody. So thank you.
I appreciate it, man. Let's stay in touch. Enjoy your trip to go see Shriekback, and we'll do this again.
Yeah, definitely.
Thanks for listening, everybody. Hope you enjoyed this episode of The Edge of the Unknown. Much more to come. Special thanks to the sponsors of the program, as well as Mark 9 of Houston, Texas, for supplying the bump music for the show. If you have any questions or comments, or would like to suggest a guest you'd like to hear, email theedgeoftheunknown@gmail.com. Find me on social media, too. We're going to be boosting those efforts shortly. Thanks, everybody. I'll see you next time, right here on The Edge.